The courthouse records of Dalton County, Virginia, are not supposed to be remarkable. They are the kind of documents historians expect to skim, not study. Land deeds, birth certificates, marriage licenses, property transfers, paperwork that exists to record ownership of land, of names, of people. But hidden among those ordinary records is something that doesn't belong. 11 murder investigations, all solved, all signed by the same man, all resolved within a single decade. At first glance, it looks like the work of an exceptionally skilled sheriff, Thomas Whitlock. His name appears repeatedly in local histories, a respected lawman, a symbol of order in an uncertain time, a man whose reputation still hangs, quite literally, on the courthouse wall in the form of a bronze plaque. But if you read the actual case files, not the summaries, not the newspaper accounts, something feels wrong.
In the margins, written in a different hand, are observations the sheriff could not have made. Notes on soil composition, descriptions of blood patterns, deductions about human behavior that wouldn't become common investigative practice for another half-century. And at the bottom of each file, 2 initials, carefully written, then violently scratched out. J.T. No full name, no explanation, no acknowledgement, just an absence. Because whoever J.T. was, he was not meant to be remembered. Before we continue the story of how Virginia's most brilliant criminal investigator worked in chains and how his genius was deliberately erased, take a moment. Subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, and comment below which state or country you're watching from. Stories like this survive only when people choose to listen. Now, to understand how those initials came to exist at all, we have to return to a place balanced on the edge of 2 Americas. Dalton County, Virginia. The year is 1847. A town where law existed, but justice did not belong to everyone. And where the most dangerous thing a man could possess was intelligence no one wanted him to have.
Dalton County in 1847 was a place caught between 2 worlds. To the east, the rail line ran toward Richmond, carrying tobacco, letters, and ambition. To the west, the land rose gently toward the Blue Ridge Mountains, where isolation still protected old ways of life. Harpersville, the county seat, sat right in the middle, 6 blocks of brick buildings, dusty roads, and unspoken rules. 3,000 people lived there. 2,000 were white. 800 were enslaved. 200 were free black residents, tolerated but watched, allowed to exist but never to belong. The courthouse stood at the center of town, a Greek revival building with white columns meant to symbolize reason, order, and civilization. But, like most symbols in the antebellum South, it lied. Inside those walls, justice followed ownership. Who you were mattered less than who owned you, and truth itself bent to protect power. Sheriff Thomas Whitlock knew this better than anyone. He had held the position for 4 years, elected not because of skill or intelligence, but because his family owned the 2nd largest plantation in the county. Whitlock was not a fool, but neither was he brilliant.
He was a man of average ability and exceptional confidence. A thick mustache he waxed daily, a booming laugh meant to fill rooms, a reputation built on intimidation rather than insight. Until 1847, Dalton County hadn't demanded much of him. Petty thefts, drunken brawls at the tavern, occasional disputes over land boundaries. These were problems a man like Whitlock could manage with threats, favors, and family connections. Serious crime was rare, and murder? Murder was unthinkable. That illusion shattered one spring morning. Margaret Hayes was 17 years old, the daughter of the county's wealthiest merchant, educated, respected, protected by wealth and reputation. When her body was found in Blackwell Creek, 3 miles from town, Harpersville panicked. Her pale blue dress was torn, her bonnet was missing, dark bruises ringed her neck. The white community reacted immediately and predictably. Women refused to walk alone. Church attendance doubled overnight. Rumors spread faster than facts. And all eyes turned to Sheriff Whitlock. For the first time in his career, he faced a crime he did not know how to solve. He questioned drifters, free black men who happened to be nearby, a mentally disabled stable hand who could barely speak. None of it led anywhere. There were no witnesses, no clear evidence, no understanding of how the crime had occurred. Within a week, the investigation stalled, and that's when Whitlock did something that would change the course of history, even if history would later pretend it never happened. He turned to his youngest slave.
Josiah Turner was 22 years old, born on the Whitlock plantation. Mother dead in childbirth, father unknown. By every legal definition of the time, he was property. And yet, from the moment he was a child, Josiah had been dangerous. Not because he was violent, but because he noticed things. Old Mrs. Whitlock, Thomas's mother, had taken an unusual interest in the boy. At first it was harmless. She taught him to read the Bible so he could recite scripture to her as her eyesight failed. But Josiah learned quickly. Too quickly. By 8, he could read fluently. By 10, he had found his way into the late Mr. Whitlock's library. Law books, medical texts, scientific journals collecting dust. No one had intended for a slave to touch them, but no one noticed. And when Thomas Whitlock inherited the plantation, he discovered Josiah reading a treatise on human anatomy in his father's study. He should have punished him. Instead, he saw an opportunity. Whitlock began using Josiah as a quiet assistant, reading documents aloud, summarizing letters, explaining things Whitlock did not understand. Josiah never corrected him, never challenged him, never showed emotion. He learned early that survival required silence. Now, in the shadow of Margaret Hayes's death, Whitlock remembered the slave who read books. One evening, in the study, tobacco smoke curling toward the ceiling, Whitlock made an offer that was not really an offer at all. "You help me figure out who killed that girl, and I'll see that you're treated better." Sunday afternoons, extra food, access to books. Josiah understood the truth. Refusal was not an option. But curiosity, that dangerous thing, stirred anyway. He agreed. Neither man realized what they had just begun, because the next morning,
Before dawn, Sheriff Thomas Whitlock took a slave to a crime scene, and nothing in Dalton County would ever be the same.
They left before sunrise. Sheriff Thomas Whitlock rode ahead on horseback, the road still wet with morning dew. Behind him, walking 3 paces back, was Josiah Turner. Not beside him, not behind the saddle, 3 paces back. Close enough to be useful, far enough to never be mistaken for equal. Whitlock was careful about appearances, even when no one was watching. The road to Blackwell Creek wound through low hills and thin stands of pine. Birds were just beginning to stir, their calls sharp in the cold air. Neither man spoke. When they reached the creek, the mist was still hanging low over the water. Blackwell Creek ran fast that time of year, fed by mountain runoff. Its banks were narrow, crowded by trees whose roots twisted into the soil like exposed veins. This was where Margaret Hayes had been found. The grass near the water was trampled. Boot prints overlapped each other. The ground showed signs of dozens of men walking through the same space. Whatever evidence had once existed had already been disturbed. Whitlock dismounted and lit a cigar. "So," he said, exhaling smoke, "what do you see?" Josiah said nothing at first. He stood still, eyes moving slowly across the scene, taking in details Whitlock had never thought to note.
The grass leaned toward the water, the direction of the flattened reeds, the color difference between wet mud and recently disturbed soil. "May I walk around, sir?" Josiah asked quietly. Whitlock waved his hand. "That's why I brought you." Josiah moved slowly along the bank, crouching now and then, touching the earth with careful fingers. He followed the creek upstream, then downstream, nearly a quarter-mile in each direction. Whitlock grew restless. He smoked one cigar, then another. Finally, Josiah returned. "She wasn't killed here, sir." Whitlock frowned. "What do you mean? Her body was found right there." "Yes, sir," Josiah said calmly, "but she died somewhere else." Whitlock's irritation sharpened. "And how do you know that?" Josiah gestured toward the ground. "The grass is flattened toward the water, not away from it. That means the body was dragged here, not attacked here." Whitlock stared at the ground as if seeing it for the first time. "And there's no blood in the soil," Josiah continued. "Yet her dress had blood on it." Whitlock hesitated. "The coroner said she had a head wound." "Yes, sir, and head wounds bleed heavily." Josiah pointed to the earth. "If she had been struck here, the soil would show it, but there's nothing, which means the blood on her clothing came from an earlier location." Whitlock said nothing. Josiah turned and pointed upstream. "There are cartwheel marks about 200 yards that way, fresh ones. The rain 2 nights ago would have erased anything older." Whitlock's cigar burned forgotten between his fingers. "And near the water," Josiah added, "there's a partial boot print, large, size 11 or 12, heavy tread, military style, not common in this county." Whitlock finally looked at him directly. "How in God's name can you see all that?"
Josiah didn't answer. Instead, he asked a question. "Did Miss Hayes have someone she was meeting in secret, sir?" The silence that followed was heavy. "That's not your concern," Whitlock snapped. "No, sir," Josiah replied evenly. "But if she trusted someone enough to meet alone, that person is where we should look." Whitlock turned away, jaw tight. After a long moment, he spoke.
"There was a soldier stationed near Charlottesville, Captain Samuel Pritchard." Josiah nodded. "And who owns carts that would leave marks like those near the creek?" Whitlock exhaled slowly. For the first time, he realized something unsettling. He wasn't being helped. He was being led. Over the next 3 days, Whitlock followed Josiah's quiet direction. They visited homes under the pretense of routine questioning. Josiah waited outside, listening through open windows, watching hands, noting who avoided certain questions. Then, in the Hayes family stable, Josiah saw something that made his chest tighten. Hidden beneath loose hay in an unused stall, a bonnet. Blue ribbon, expensive lace. Margaret Hayes's bonnet. Inside the crown were dark stains. Blood. And caught in the ribbon, a single dark hair. Not hers. Josiah did not touch it. He stepped back. When Whitlock arrived later that afternoon, he went into the stable alone. He found the bonnet himself. The arrest came quickly. The confession came faster. The stable master, Douglas Fletcher, broke down completely. He had helped arrange secret meetings. He had grown obsessed, and when Margaret rejected him, he struck her. One blow, fatal. 6 weeks later, Fletcher was hanged, and Dalton County breathed again. The newspapers celebrated Sheriff Whitlock's brilliance, his keen eye, his relentless pursuit of truth. Josiah Turner's name appeared nowhere, not in print, not in praise, just scratched initials at the bottom of a file. And that should have been the end of it. But 6 weeks after the execution, another body was found. And this time, the victim wasn't someone the law cared about.
6 weeks after Douglas Fletcher's execution, the second body was discovered. This time, there were no church bells, no public panic, no newspaper boys shouting headlines in the street. Because the dead man was a slave. His name was Benjamin. He belonged to the Patterson family, owners of the textile mill on the Shenandoah River's edge, a place where water-powered machines and human lives were considered replaceable parts. Benjamin was found in the mill's lower level, crushed beneath a fallen beam. The assumption was immediate: an accident. Mills were dangerous, beams fell, slaves died. The law rarely asked questions, but Benjamin's wife did. Her name was Dina, and she did something that could have cost her everything. She went to the courthouse. She stood in the lobby, barefoot, shaking, refusing to move, and told anyone who would listen that her husband had been murdered, that the beam had been loosened on purpose, that Benjamin had seen something he was not supposed to see. Most people ignored her. Some laughed. But Sheriff Thomas Whitlock didn't. Not because he cared about Benjamin, but because he cared about his reputation. If he could solve even a slave's murder, his legend would grow. The next morning, Whitlock brought Josiah Turner to the mill. The building shook with the rhythm of machines. Cotton dust filled the air, coating the throat, stinging the eyes. The beam that killed Benjamin was massive, solid oak, hundreds of pounds. Josiah studied where it had fallen. Then he examined where it had been mounted. The bolt holes were wrong. Fresh wood showed through where aged timber should have been. "Someone widened these," Josiah said quietly. Whitlock leaned closer. "They weakened the mount so the beam would fall." Whitlock swallowed. "Who worked down here with him?" "3 other slaves," Whitlock replied. Josiah nodded. "And his wife." This investigation was different. Slaves did not speak openly when white men were present, but Josiah had something Whitlock didn't know existed: a network. Sunday church meetings, coded conversations, messages passed through shared labor. Through those invisible channels, Josiah learned the truth. Marcus Patterson, the mill owner's eldest son. He had been stealing from his own family, altering ledgers, skimming profits, selling cloth through a Richmond dealer. Benjamin had noticed. He had spoken up. 2 days later, he was dead. But accusation was not evidence, and accusing a wealthy white man based on slave testimony would go nowhere. Josiah needed proof. So he did something reckless. One night, while Whitlock drank himself unconscious at the tavern, Josiah returned to the mill. After dark, alone. A slave caught out after curfew could be shot without question. But Josiah knew the office. He knew the lock. He had learned how locks worked from a book on engineering in the Whitlock library. Inside, by candlelight, he found 2 sets of books, one official, one hidden. The difference was staggering. Nearly $2,000 unaccounted for, a fortune. Josiah did not take the ledger. Instead, he arranged for Whitlock to discover it. The next morning, Marcus Patterson confessed to fraud, not murder. There was no direct evidence tying him to the beam. Anyone, his lawyer argued, could have loosened the bolts. Marcus served 2 years. Benjamin remained dead. Dina received nothing. Once again, the newspapers praised Sheriff Whitlock. Once again, Josiah's name did not appear. But something changed. Among the enslaved, whispers spread. There was a man who could see truth. And the sheriff, he began to depend on the slave who read law books. Because without him, Whitlock was nothing.
By that end of summer, people in Dalton County had begun to believe something impossible: that Sheriff Thomas Whitlock had changed, that he had become sharper, more observant, almost gifted. What they didn't see was the man standing 3 paces behind him. They didn't see Josiah Turner sketching crime scenes in charcoal on scraps of paper late at night. Didn't see him replaying conversations in his head, word for word, searching for inconsistencies. Didn't see him studying human behavior the way other men studied scripture. Because Josiah was doing something no one around him had language for. He was practicing forensic investigation, decades before the word existed. When a theft occurred, Josiah separated witnesses, quietly suggesting Whitlock speak to them one at a time. People lied differently when alone. When a barn burned, Josiah examined ash patterns and burn direction, identifying where the fire had actually started. When a body was found, he looked not just at wounds, but at what they implied: angle, force, intention. Whitlock thought this was instinct. Josiah knew it was study. From books, from observation, from a mind trained to notice what others ignored. Over the next 8 years, 11 murders crossed Dalton County's boundaries, and one by one they were solved. A farmer found dead in his field, trampled, not attacked. A woman poisoned by someone who cooked her meals. A man stabbed during a robbery that wasn't actually about money. Each case followed the same pattern. Publicly, Whitlock led the investigation. Privately, Josiah built it. And always, at the bottom of the files, those same initials, J.T. Sometimes written carefully, sometimes hastily, sometimes crossed out so violently the paper tore. But Josiah kept his own record. Hidden in the small cabin he shared with 3 other slaves, he stored pages torn from discarded ledgers, scraps of notices, even birch bark when nothing else was available. On them he documented everything: what was observed, why it mattered, what conclusion followed. It was illegal for a slave to read. It was more illegal for one to write. What Josiah was creating wasn't just dangerous, it was proof. And proof in the wrong hands could get him killed. As Whitlock's reputation grew, so did his dependence. He began allowing Josiah freedoms no other slave had: late nights out, unsupervised conversations, access to records. Not because Whitlock believed in him, but because Whitlock feared losing him. Because without Josiah, the truth would come out. And then came the case that forced Josiah to confront something worse than erasure: the realization that justice itself could be manipulated, that sometimes the law didn't want the truth, it wanted a story. And sometimes Josiah would have to decide which one survived.
By the autumn of 1855, Dalton County had begun to fear its own reflection. For years, crime had been something that happened quietly on the edges of society. But now, violence was touching men whose names carried weight. The first body was found on a Monday morning. George Hamilton, wealthy landowner, respected, found in his study with a knife wound to the chest. The house hadn't been robbed, nothing was disturbed. There were no signs of forced entry. 2 days later, Edward Crawley, Hamilton's business partner, was discovered strangled in his carriage on the road to Richmond. By Friday, Hamilton's lawyer, Theodore Walsh, was dead at the bottom of his staircase. On Sunday, the banker who managed all their accounts, Robert Finch, was found poisoned in his home. 4 men, 4 deaths, 1 week. Panic spread through Harpersville like fever. People whispered about conspiracies, about vengeance, about a killer targeting the town's elite. Sheriff Whitlock was overwhelmed. He turned to Josiah with desperation in his voice. He said, "Find me the connection. There has to be one." Josiah worked without rest. He studied financial records, interviewed household staff, visited each scene. And slowly, a pattern emerged. 15 years earlier, the 4 men had created a land scheme.
They sold property to immigrant families, Irish and German arrivals desperate to start over. They took payment, then used legal technicalities to reclaim the land. They resold it, again and again. Dozens of families ruined. But fraud wasn't murder. So who had killed them? The answer came from someone no one noticed. Patrick O'Connor, 15 years old. His father had hanged himself after losing their farm. His mother had died of cholera the next winter. Patrick lived behind the church, surviving on scraps. When Josiah spoke with him, quietly, carefully, he noticed things. Rope burns on his hands, a limp from a recent injury, the faint smell of bitter almonds on his coat. Arsenic. Josiah understood immediately. Patrick had killed them all, one by one, with planning, with patience, with grief. And suddenly, Josiah faced a choice that would haunt him forever. Turn the boy in, condemn him to the gallows, or protect him and condemn someone else. Josiah chose. He told Whitlock everything, except the name. Instead, he pointed Whitlock toward a drifter, a man with a criminal record, no family, no one to defend him. The evidence Josiah constructed was circumstantial, but convincing. The drifter was convicted, hanged, proclaiming innocence until the end. Patrick O'Connor left town a week later. Sheriff Whitlock received his highest commendation yet. The newspapers called the case a masterwork. Josiah wrote one sentence in
Her name was Clara Haysworth, and in 1856 that alone made her an anomaly. Women did not investigate crimes. They did not question sheriffs. They did not ask how justice was made. Clara did all three. Officially, she wrote for the Richmond Herald under her father's byline. Unofficially, she was the one doing the work. She had a sharp eye for inconsistencies, the kind that didn't show up in headlines, only in footnotes. When Sheriff Thomas Whitlock's reputation began spreading beyond Dalton County, Clara took notice. A rural sheriff, no formal education, solving complex murders with methods that sounded unfamiliar. Too precise, too modern. So she traveled to Harpersville. Whitlock welcomed her eagerly. He enjoyed admiration. He walked her through case files, told stories of long nights and sharp instincts. Clara listened and noticed what he didn't. That his explanations were vague where the records were specific. That he spoke confidently about conclusions, but stumbled when asked how he reached them. She requested to see the original files. Whitlock hesitated, then agreed. Clara read every page, and there it was. Marginal notes in a different handwriting. Observations Whitlock could not explain. Language that did not belong to a man who struggled with basic arithmetic. She asked him directly, "These notes, who wrote them?" Whitlock smiled thinly. "Just my own thoughts. I jot things down." Clara didn't challenge him. Not yet. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She started asking slaves questions. Most refused to speak. A white woman asking questions was not safety, it was risk. But eventually, one housemaid whispered a sentence that changed everything. "He's the one who figures it out," the woman said quietly. "The sheriff just writes it down." The name she gave was barely audible. Josiah. Clara tried to see him. That was impossible. Slaves could not be interviewed, could not be quoted, could not be acknowledged as thinkers.
But Clara persisted. She traced Josiah's history, found stories of a boy allowed near books, of a man seen reading law texts, of someone who walked behind the sheriff but somehow led every investigation. She realized she wasn't chasing a good sheriff. She was chasing stolen genius. When Clara brought her findings to her editor, he didn't even pretend to consider them. "You can't print this," he said flatly. "You're claiming a Negro slave is smarter than white lawmen." She argued, she pleaded, she threatened to take the story north. Her editor gave her a choice: drop the story or lose her position. Clara chose the truth. She resigned. And then she tried to publish the story anyway. Northern papers hesitated. They supported abolition in theory, but this, a slave pioneering criminal investigation, that challenged too much. So Clara took a final risk. She went back to Harpersville, rented a room above the general store, and over 3 months she documented everything. Every case, every contradiction, every erased initial. And finally, she met Josiah Turner 3 times, in secret. If discovered, he could be sold south. She could be charged with incitement. But Josiah showed her his hidden files, pages of brilliance, pages of compromise. When she asked him why he continued working for Whitlock, his answer was simple: "Because, while I help him, I can help people he never would." Clara named the manuscript The Invisible Detective, and the world was not ready to read it.
Clara Hayworth finished the manuscript in the spring of 1859. She titled it carefully, The Invisible Detective: How Virginia's Most Brilliant Criminal Investigator Remained Enslaved and Unnamed. It was not written to shock. It was written to prove. Page after page documented cases, methods, dates, handwriting comparisons, and witness accounts. It didn't accuse, it demonstrated, and that made it dangerous. Clara sent the manuscript to every newspaper that would accept unsolicited work. The responses came slowly, some polite, some dismissive, some silent. One editor wrote that the story was interesting but implausible. Another said it was too inflammatory for the current climate. A third was more honest. "Even if this is true," he wrote, "printing it would destabilize public confidence in Southern institutions." Clara tried a different route: abolitionist societies. Surely they would understand the importance. Some did. But even among those who opposed slavery, discomfort surfaced. A slave demonstrating intellectual superiority? That disrupted carefully constructed narratives, even sympathetic ones. Then Clara decided to publish it herself. She paid a printer in Richmond to produce a small pamphlet run. She planned to distribute them through churches and abolitionist networks. The printing date was October 14, 1859. 2 days later, John Brown raided Harper's Ferry. The South erupted in fear. Any material suggesting black intelligence or capability was suddenly labeled dangerous propaganda. The printer refused to release the pamphlets. Most were destroyed. Clara managed to save 50 copies. She sent them north: Boston, Philadelphia, New York. But history had moved on. The nation was sliding toward war.
A story about a slave detective in rural Virginia felt insignificant beside the coming collapse. Clara planned to try again after things settled. They never did. In 1861, war came. Clara became a medical volunteer. In 1862, she contracted typhoid fever. She died at 31. Her work scattered, forgotten. Meanwhile, Josiah Turner remained enslaved, and soon he would be erased completely. Because in 1862, Sheriff Thomas Whitlock made a decision that revealed exactly how afraid he was of the man behind him.
By the summer of 1862, the war had finally reached Dalton County. Union forces pressed deeper into Virginia. Rail lines became targets. Courthouses burned. Order dissolved into uncertainty. Sheriff Thomas Whitlock did not hesitate. He leveraged his reputation and family connections into a Confederate officer's commission. A captain. It was the kind of promotion that looked like honor. But before Whitlock left Harpersville, he faced a problem: Josiah Turner. He could not take Josiah with him. The Army had no place for a slave detective. But leaving him behind was worse. What if Josiah ran? What if Union troops liberated him? What if the man who knew every secret of Whitlock's career spoke? Whitlock's solution was simple. He sold him. Not locally, not nearby, as far away as possible. Mississippi, to a cotton plantation known for breaking men. The sale took place in August. Josiah was 37 years old. He was shackled and loaded into a wagon with 30 other enslaved people. They traveled south for 3 weeks. Minimal food, little water, open pens at night. By the time they arrived, several were already sick. The buyer was Cyrus Merchant. 12,000 acres of cotton, a death rate so high it was spoken about in whispers. Nearly 1 in 4 enslaved people died within 5 years of arrival. Josiah was assigned to the fields. For 2 months he picked cotton until his hands bled. Then something happened. The overseer, Tobias Grant, was found dead in a barn, killed by a shovel blow to the head. The weapon was planted in another slave's cabin, a man named Daniel. Daniel was scheduled for execution, and Josiah did something no slave was allowed to do. He approached the plantation owner directly. Daniel is innocent. Merchant should have had him whipped. Instead, he listened. Josiah explained. The blow was left-handed. Daniel was right-handed. Cotton fibers under Grant's fingernails matched a high-grade variety only the overseer's son handled. Blood spatter on the son's boots told the rest. The truth came out. The overseer's son had killed his father. Daniel lived. Josiah was moved into the main house. Inventory, logistics. Not freedom, but survival. And when the war ended in 1865, Josiah Turner was finally free. But freedom, it turned out, was not the same as recognition.
Freedom came to Josiah Turner quietly. No ceremony, no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been taken from him. In the spring of 1865, Union forces liberated Mississippi's plantations. Josiah was 40 years old, underfed, scarred, but alive. He believed, briefly, that freedom might mean truth, that the work he had done, the lives he had saved, would finally be recognized. So he returned to Virginia. Dalton County barely resembled the place he remembered. The courthouse had burned. Records were scattered. Federal troops occupied the town. Sheriff Thomas Whitlock was dead, killed at Fredericksburg. Josiah saw opportunity in the chaos. He approached Union officials, explained his experience. 11 murder investigations, advanced methods, years of work. They laughed. One officer told him plainly, "We need laborers, not colored men playing detective." Josiah searched the surviving courthouse files. The marginal notes were gone. The initials scratched away. J.T. erased. Someone had made sure of it. Desperate, Josiah searched for Clara Highworth's pamphlet. He wrote to abolitionist societies. No copies surfaced. History had already chosen silence. By 1867, Josiah was working as a carpenter in Richmond. He married, had 2 daughters, never investigated another crime. Not because he couldn't, because no one would. When he died in 1891, his death certificate listed his occupation as laborer. 4 sentences in a black-owned newspaper. That was all that remained, until someone noticed.
In 1923, more than 30 years after Josiah Turner's death, Dalton County was quiet again. The war was a memory. Reconstruction had hardened into segregation. Jim Crow was law, custom, and threat all at once. That was when William Marsh arrived. He was a graduate student at the University of Virginia, researching the history of criminal justice in the state. His focus was narrow: procedural evolution, how rural law enforcement modernized in the 19th century. He did not come looking for injustice. He came looking for footnotes. Dalton County's records were thin, many lost to fire, but what survived intrigued him. Sheriff Thomas Whitlock appeared again and again. An unusually high number of murder cases. Remarkably sophisticated reasoning for a rural sheriff with no formal education. Marsh began reading the original files. Slowly, carefully. That's when he noticed it. The handwriting changed. Not once, not occasionally, consistently. Whitlock's reports were blunt, poorly structured, but the marginal notes, precise, analytical, forward-thinking. Marsh began comparing samples, letter forms, spacing, pressure. The marginal notes were written by the same hand, and that hand was not Whitlock's. At the bottom of 11 murder files, he found the same thing: scratched initials, J.T. Marsh couldn't let it go. He searched census records, property ledgers, bills of sale. Then he found it. An 1862 document transferring ownership of a slave named Josiah Turner from Thomas Whitlock to a Mississippi plantation owner. The connection was impossible to ignore. The dates matched. The initials matched. The handwriting.
Marsh tracked down Josiah's death certificate in Richmond. Occupation, laborer, nothing more. Then he found Josiah's daughter, Rebecca Turner, 71 years old. She remembered her father sitting by lamplit, reading, writing, talking about helping the sheriff. She had never known what that meant. Marsh assembled everything into his dissertation. His conclusion was careful, measured, devastating. Virginia's most celebrated antebellum sheriff had not solved his famous cases. They had been solved by his enslaved assistant, a self-educated black man whose contributions were deliberately erased. The committee rejected it, not because it was wrong, but because it was dangerous. His advisor was blunt. Even if this is true, and I'm not saying it isn't, publishing it serves no useful purpose. Revise the dissertation. Remove the claim. Marsh refused. And just like Clara Highworth before him, he paid the price.
William Marsh believed facts would protect him. He was wrong. After his dissertation was rejected at the University of Virginia, he did not give up. He revised nothing. He removed nothing. Instead, he sent the work to 3 other universities. Each was polite. Each was final. One committee wrote that the research was methodologically sound but socially destabilizing. Another suggested that Marsh had overinterpreted circumstantial evidence. A third rejected it without comment. Marsh tried academic journals. One editor at Columbia University showed real interest. He called the work meticulous, historically significant. Then came the letter. It praised the scholarship and declined publication. The reason was written carefully. Our board fears the reaction from Southern subscribers. Claims regarding Negro intellectual capacity remained sensitive. Marsh understood the message. The problem was not accuracy, it was discomfort. Publishing the truth would challenge a system that depended on selective memory. Marsh never finished his doctorate. In 1924, he left academia. He became a high school teacher in Baltimore. His research went into boxes in his basement. For 40 years, it sat there, waiting. William Marsh died in 1968. There was no academic obituary, no mention of his abandoned dissertation. To the world, he was a retired high school teacher. When his son cleaned out the basement, he found boxes, old papers, yellowed notes, handwritten drafts. Most of it looked useless, outdated, irrelevant. He threw nearly everything away. Nearly. One folder remained, tucked inside a book his father had marked as important. The folder contained copies of courthouse records, handwriting comparisons, and a name written repeatedly in the margins: Josiah Turner. The book changed hands over decades. A used bookstore, a private collector, a donation. In 1995, it arrived at the University of Virginia's Special Collections. In 2003, a research librarian opened it and noticed something strange. The librarian did not know Josiah Turner's name. Not at first. She only knew that something was wrong.
The folder inside the donated book contained photocopies of 19th-century case files, handwriting charts, and marginal notes that did not match the official author. There were dates, there were initials, and there was a pattern. She flagged it for the history department. At first, the response was cautious, then curious, then serious. A small team of historians began retracing William Marsh's work. They verified the handwriting, matched census records, located surviving bills of sale, confirmed plantation transfers. They found more than Marsh ever had. Additional courthouse files with the same marginal handwriting. A faded photograph from 1870 showing an older black man standing beside a partially constructed building in Richmond. Family records identified him. Josiah Turner, the man who had been erased. 2 years of verification followed. No speculation, no exaggeration, just documentation. In 2006, the findings were published. The article was titled carefully, "Invisible Justice: Uncovering the Contributions of Josiah Turner to Antebellum Criminal Investigation." It won awards. It was cited in textbooks. It was real. But recognition came with limits. If you visit Harpersville today, the courthouse still stands. It has been rebuilt, renovated, repainted. The columns are clean, the floors polished, the past made presentable. And on the wall, just inside the entrance, hangs a bronze plaque. It reads, "Sheriff Thomas Whitlock, a tireless servant of justice, renowned for his keen investigative skill and dedication to the safety of Dalton County." The plaque does not lie. It simply does not tell the whole truth. There is no mention of Josiah Turner, not beside it, not beneath it, not anywhere on the wall. In 2008, a local civil rights organization petitioned the county government. They asked for official recognition of Josiah's role, not to remove Whitlock's plaque, not to rewrite history, just to complete it. The proposal sparked debate, closed-door meetings, carefully worded objections. Some officials argued there wasn't enough public interest. Others worried it would confuse visitors. A few said acknowledging Josiah would unfairly diminish Whitlock's legacy. 2 years passed. Finally, the county approved a compromise, a small commemorative marker. It was placed in the lobby, several feet away from the plaque. The text read, "Josiah Turner, 1825 to 1891. Enslaved person who contributed to criminal investigations in Dalton County during the 1840s and 1850s. His work remained unrecognized until historical research uncovered his involvement in 2006. Contributed, not solved, not pioneered, not led." The language was deliberate, careful enough to avoid discomfort. When the marker was installed, the local newspaper ran a brief article. The headline read, "New research sheds light on sheriff's work." Not slave detective revealed, not genius in chains. The focus remained where it had always been, on the man history was comfortable celebrating. Josiah's name appeared only as a footnote. Even now, even after proof, even after publication, The erasure continued, quieter, more polite, but no less real. And that leaves us with a question. If it took more than a century to admit Josiah Turner existed, how many others never will?
Josiah Turner's story unsettles people for a reason. It isn't just about slavery. It isn't just about stolen credit. It's about how history decides what is allowed to be remembered. Josiah did not fail. He was not forgotten because his work lacked value. He was erased because his brilliance threatened a narrative that needed him to be ordinary, or better yet, invisible. Think about what had to happen for his name to disappear. Someone scratched out those initials. Someone denied Clara Hesworth publication. Someone rejected William Marsh's dissertation. Again and again, different people, different decades, the same decision. This truth is inconvenient. Erasure, Josiah's story teaches us, is not accidental. It is maintained. And it comes at a cost. Because when a society decides that certain minds don't count, it doesn't just steal credit, it steals possibility. Josiah developed investigative techniques decades ahead of his time. What if he'd been allowed to teach? What if his methods had been shared, refined, improved? How many crimes went unsolved elsewhere because the wrong people were allowed to innovate? How many lives were lost because genius was locked behind chains? We like to imagine progress as inevitable, but Josiah's life proves something darker. Progress is selective, and often it arrives late, after the people who deserved it are gone. Yet his story leaves us with something else, a responsibility. Because now that we know, forgetting becomes a choice.
There is a question that never appears in the records. Not in the courthouse files. Not in Clara Hayworth's notes. Not in William Marsh's research. Because it was never written down. But it hangs over Josiah Turner's life like a shadow. What would he have become if the world had allowed him to be seen? Not hypothetically, not romantically, practically. Josiah did not imagine himself as a hero. He did not speak about legacy. Everything we know suggests he thought in terms of usefulness. Who could be protected? Who could be spared? Which harm could be reduced? That is why he kept working even after understanding the cost. That is why he accepted silence. Because in a system designed to crush him, silence was leverage. But silence is also a prison. And over time, it takes something with it. By the end of his life, Josiah rarely spoke about the past. His daughters remembered him as gentle, thoughtful, a man who read in the evenings and taught neighbors how to fill out legal forms. He never told them about the drifter who died in his place, never explained why certain memories made him quiet. Some knowledge, he understood, does not liberate. It only weighs. And yet, even stripped of recognition, Josiah left something behind. Not a name in history books, but a pattern. Because the methods he developed, careful observation, separating witnesses, reading behavior instead of reputation, began appearing elsewhere, attributed to other men, in other places. Years later, his ideas survived.
detached from him. And that may be the most unsettling part of all, that brilliance can be stolen and still reshape the world, that a man can be erased and still influence history anonymously, which leads to the question Josiah never got to ask out loud. If my work mattered, why didn't my life?
Josiah Turner survived by accident. A folder misplaced. A librarian curious enough to look twice. A century of silence broken by chance. Most stories like his don't survive at all. For every Josiah whose initials were scratched out, there were others whose names were never written down to begin with. Men and women who solved problems, built systems, healed wounds, understood patterns, all while legally defined as property. Their knowledge was used, their labor consumed, their minds erased, and the record reflects that absence. History often tells us what happened. Rarely does it tell us who made it happen, especially when acknowledging them would disrupt power. We inherit narratives polished over generations. They feel stable, complete, but stability can be a sign of something missing, because real history is messy, contradictory, uncomfortable. Josiah Turner unsettles us not because he was exceptional, but because he likely wasn't alone. If one enslaved man in rural Virginia could teach himself law, medicine, and behavioral analysis, what does that imply about the thousands who were never allowed to try? What innovations never happened? What crimes were never solved? What futures were quietly buried? The erasure wasn't just of individuals, it was of potential. And that erasure didn't end with emancipation. It continued through selective memory, through polite language, through plaques that tell partial truths. Which is why this story isn't finished, because it's not really about Josiah Turner. It's about how we decide who counts.
There is a reason stories like this are uncomfortable. They force a choice: comfort or truth. Comfort tells us the past was flawed but well-intentioned, that injustice was unfortunate, not engineered, that credit mostly went where it belonged. Truth says otherwise. Truth says systems are built to protect themselves, not fairness. Truth says recognition is power, and power decides who is remembered. Truth says history is not what happened, but what survived. Josiah Turner threatens comfort, because if his brilliance could be erased so completely, if multiple generations actively chose silence, then we are not just inheritors of a broken past, we are beneficiaries of selective memory. It is easier to honor the plaque than to explain why it exists without context. Easier to say contributed than to admit led. Easier to accept partial truth than to confront deliberate erasure. And yet, truth has a way of resurfacing, not loudly, not triumphantly, but persistently, in marginal notes, in scratched initials, in stories passed down without names attached. The question is not whether the truth exists. It always does. The question is whether we are willing to sit with it once it appears. because acknowledging Josiah Turner does something radical. It reframes intelligence, it reframes innovation, it reframes who history is for. And that is why this story still matters, not as a correction, but as a warning. That erasure doesn't end when chains are broken. It ends when truth is allowed to stand, even when it makes us uneasy.
There is a moment late in the evening when courthouses are empty. The doors are locked, the lights dim, and the walls stop pretending they are neutral. In Dalton County, if you stand alone in the rebuilt courthouse lobby, you will see two markers. One large, bronze, confident. The other small, careful, easy to miss. One celebrates a sheriff. The other mentions an enslaved man who contributed. Between them is the distance history created on purpose. Josiah Turner never stood in that building as a free man while his work was celebrated. He never saw his name printed beside his achievements. He never heard applause for the lives he saved. What he did hear, again and again, was silence. And silence, repeated long enough, begins to feel like truth. But silence is not truth. It is a choice. Someone chose to scratch out those initials. Someone chose not to publish Clara Ellsworth's work. Someone chose to reject William Marsh's research. And someone chose to soften the language on that plaque. Every generation made a decision to preserve comfort over accuracy. But here is the thing about erased names. They leave impressions, ghost outlines in the record, marginal notes that don't match, methods that appear without origin, stories that don't quite add up. Josiah Turner's life proves that brilliance does not need permission to exist, but it does need permission to be remembered. And that permission has been withheld far more often than we like to admit. So when you hear stories of great detectives, of pioneering thinkers, of sudden leaps in knowledge, ask yourself, who is being named and who is missing? Because somewhere in an archive or a forgotten box, there may be another set of initials, crossed out so violently the paper tore, another life reduced to a footnote, another mind that changed the world without being allowed to claim it. Josiah Turner solved 11 murders. He developed investigative techniques decades ahead of their time. He protected people the law did not care about. And history tried very hard to make sure you never knew his name. Now you do. And that means the erasure failed. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough. So the next time you walk past a plaque or read a headline or hear a story that feels too simple, pause. Look for the margins, because that's where the truth usually lives. If you believe stories like this matter, stories that uncover forgotten history and challenge what we think we know, subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications and share this story with someone who believes the past still has something to teach us. Because remembering Josiah Turner isn't just about correcting history. It's about refusing to let brilliance disappear just because it once lived in chains. His name was Josiah Turner, and now it belongs to history again.